Okay, this is part 7. And I'm starting at book 3, subtitled Murder and Black Ops. And you can hear anything I read before these chapters in the videos that are uploaded before this one. Okay. Just a minute. Okay, after Alexander's death, I returned to the Quigleys while Jackie and Aristotle carved out a domain in Bullhead City, Arizona, a small desert town nestled along the Colorado River. They strategically acquired the town, placing their people in every available house. We've stayed along that river many times. Okay, then in 1975, when I was 15 years old, I was picked up from the Quigleys and brought there. My heart got lighter with every mile we traveled. Finally, I was getting away. My joy even grew when the landscape transformed from lush greenery and palm tree-lined roads to arid brown soil punctuated by clusters of thorny shrubs sucking the last remnants of moisture from the dusty earth. In the late afternoon, the car pulled up in front of a modest vanilla ranch-style home atop a hill, boasting a gently sloping lawn adorned with a few palm trees. The inside was filled with lavish furnishings for a large, grander home. Aristotle boasted about how he had installed air conditioning, and we talked about changing our names and starting again. Oh, Aristotle lived in Bullhead City, Arizona. It's crazy. Okay, Jackie envisioned a life where I could work in a garage fixing cars. She was excited to start a new life with her family and forget about all the criminal corruption. But out of caution, they arranged for a camper trailer near the service station, my potential refuge in case I needed to hide out. At first, it seemed like it would work out. Jackie and Aristotle liked the desert. They were nudists. Wow, so were some people I grew up with. You know, when I was a kid, it was a thing to do, huh? They were nudists and enjoyed taking off their clothes and walking around in the hot, dry air. There was a movie theater in the town where many Hollywood stars came to practice and audition, even though it didn't have power. Actors, producers, and directors gathered in the building at night and put on productions using candles and reflectors to illuminate the stage. I remember many people being there who, to this day, are big Hollywood stars. One day I was sitting by the ravine in the middle of the desert using a kit I had to pan for gold. It was dead quiet except for the sound of burbling water, buzzing insects, and the occasional whisk of a lizard darting through the grass. Suddenly, a handful of kids came walking toward me. They ranged in age from about 8 to 18. The eldest was a boy holding a video recorder. He was a smartass. He said, "We're from Hollywood. We're making a movie, and you're not invited." I shrugged and returned to my panning. It seemed weird, but I was used to weirdness. It wasn't until I got home that I saw what kind of movie they had been making. My stepfather, Aristotle Onassis, lay dead in the side yard, covered by a bloody sheet, having been bludgeoned repeatedly with a camping axe that now lay next to his body. Oh, God. They wouldn't want this to be known to the public, would they? Okay, the kids were gone, but about 4 agents were standing there discussing what they would do and how they would send him back to Greece. I wanted to go over to Aristotle, but they held me back. One of them picked up the axe. I started crying uncontrollably. I couldn't believe Aristotle, a powerful, forceful man who seemed invincible, lay dead and lifeless under that sheet. All my hopes and dreams for the future bled out of me like the seeping red stain on the sheet and grass. I waited for someone to come over and say something to me, but they ignored me, and their voices blended like the buzz of cicadas just before dark. It was typical mob tactics, I realized with despair. Each kid probably had to take a turn hitting Aristotle with the axe while the other boy videotaped it. Why can't we arrest them right now? That way the mafia would have a murder rap on all those kids who would later become Hollywood movie stars and moneymakers for the syndicate. My mother came home later, and what happened next was blocked from my memory. Sometimes screams are soundless, like the echoing silence after a sonic boom. Amidst the grief and pandemonium that followed, Jackie was scared something would happen to me, so she told me to hide in a local restaurant. In a secluded room, I overheard the restaurant owner speaking in a frightened voice on the phone. "I don't want him here. He comes here all the time. They'll know he's here." The next day, the restaurant burned to the ground, and I relocated to my trailer next to the service station. Then Jackie sent me to Greenwich, Connecticut to stay with some Kennedys. I was at a house I'd been to before, where the Kennedy kids were always mean to me. One Kennedy boy, a real nasty kid, would routinely pummel me, so I hated going there. That day, about 6 of us kids were playing Monopoly in the house. An elderly bald man in his 60s came in with a golf club and beckoned us to follow him outside. "Come on, kids," he said. They all got up to follow him as if the whole thing had been prearranged, but then he turned around and pointed at me. "Not you, kid. You stay in the house." Feeling singled out and excluded, I waited for them to leave before settling on the sofa, sensing that something was off. Suddenly, a truck pulled up to the house. I went outside to see who it was, and a federal agent instructed me to get inside. Behind the wheel was another agent, and inside the truck were my mother and a man with a gun pointed at her head. Paralyzed with terror, my heart thudded. I looked at her, unable to utter a word. Fear gleamed in her eyes as they darted nervously between me and the road ahead. We drove to a yard where a girl's dead body lay beneath a pine tree, her long blonde hair obscuring her face. A broken, bloody golf club lay beside her in the grass. A federal agent held me by one arm, pointed at the body, and said, "That's your sister." I felt like someone threw me into a swirling tunnel of insanity. Everything was moving around me, but I was as still as a footprint in the grass as anger, grief, and horror coursed silently through me. At the same time, I had a niggling sensation of something like deja vu. I thought, I've seen this before, done this before. MK Ultra sometimes involves repetition. The scene was replayed twice. The first time I was in an MK trance state, hearing discussions about placing a body as if the agents there were setting up a crime scene and planning ideas in my head. They may have shown me my actual sister's dead body or a convincing look-alike. The thought was quickly jettisoned from my mind when the federal agent said, "Now, here's what you're going to do, kid. You're going to pick up that golf club." Okay, I'm reading it. And stab your sister with it or else we'll kill your mother. I'll be waiting in the truck. He walked away and I stood there, my insides heaving. I knew I couldn't do it. I thought, I'll just tell him I did it. I returned to the truck, and when I got in, I went completely wild. I leaped over my mother and scratched the agent's face, screaming and crying hysterically. They tried to calm me down, but I went completely nuts. When the Martha Moxley murder story broke in the news, I was convinced that it was my sister and that Martha Moxley was her undercover name in the witness protection program. For years, I never questioned the idea. Martha Moxley was my dead sister. I went crazy that day, and that notion stayed with me for many years. They wanted me to believe it, and it isn't easy to understand why. Perhaps they wanted me never to wonder or investigate what happened to my real sister. In the panic and hysteria that followed Aristotle's murder and the Martha Moxley incident, my mother was sure I was next on the hit list and asked Wayne if he could get me out of the country to keep me safe. I don't know what they were thinking. As I said, these people operated in a world of crazy. But it was decided that Wayne would take me to Vietnam. We drove to an airfield where uniformed personnel were heaving sacks of mail into the belly of an army cargo plane. Wayne told me to climb on top of the canvas sacks, and then he settled into the cockpit. We flew for hours. Finally, we landed on a dirt runway, nestled in the dense jungle. Wayne indicated a group of soldiers and said, "Go with those guys. They're going to teach you everything." He pointed a warning finger at me and added, "And whatever happens, don't tell anyone who you are." From that point, the soldiers taught me all the skills to help me stay alive in the jungle, like using a knife to cut off branches. I remember eating army food, which was terrible, like cardboard. Eventually, we met up with their unit and went out on patrol. They said, "Don't ever talk, don't ever ask a question, just shut your mouth, or we'll kill you," another guy added. Tommy was a wiry kid with hard eyes. He liked to kill people with his long machete. When it got covered in blood, he licked it off and said, "I like to taste my enemies." One day we were all eating lunch beside a pile of dead bodies. The soldiers were going through their packs, and one of them pulled out a bundle of leather straps. This guy's father was a congressman, and he said his dad told him to always have a bunch of these straps on hand because they come in handy. Tommy looked at him and nodded. Then he handed me his pocket knife and said, "Hey, kid, go and cut the ears off those bodies over there." I knew I had to do it. I had to do everything they told me. I put my foot on the ground in slow motion and stood up and walked over with the pocket knife. "Don't think," I told myself, and I started cutting off the ears and placing them in a neat pile. Yeah, it's hard to read this. Well, I've been reading without commenting about my friend, but here's one spot that I could say something. Yeah, is that my friend was forced to do this thing too when he was very young. But by a person who became by a person who, yeah, by more than one person. But a main person was this famous child serial killer who was caught and went to prison. So yeah, it pretty hard to imagine. But anyway, kudos for coming through all that. And I'm just what is empathy, where, you just can't not, whatever. Okay, sorry. Okay, so let me continue. Oh, here we go. It's going to comment about it. The funny thing about cutting off other people's ears is that you can't hear anything out of your own. Just a loud roaring sound like wind blowing on fire. I jumped when I felt something thin and snake-like fall around my neck. When I jerked my head around, Tommy was standing there grinning. He said, "We'll make you an ear necklace." He took the ears I'd already cut off, slid the leather strap through them, and tied it off before hanging it around my neck. I mean, can we just... Oh, man. And what good does all that do? Y'all, okay. As he turned to walk away, he said over his shoulder, "Keep cutting." After I cut off a few more, the commander came by and asked what we were doing. "You can't do that," he said. "You have to put those ears back." He shook his head slowly as if pondering the situation. After a sigh, he unbuttoned his breast pocket and pulled out a small plastic case. Snapping it open, he asked, "You know how to sew, kid?" I shook my head and shivered despite the heat and humidity. The commander inclined his head for me to watch him as he took out a needle and thread from the case and sewed an ear back on. The only thing was, and I guess this was meant to be the funny part, he sewed it on backwards. I took a deep breath and bent over the dead, earless bodies. Then I started sewing those ears back on the heads backward, my ear necklace bouncing against my chest as I worked. There was a big commotion while I was doing that, and everyone started getting their gear together quickly. We headed off through the jungle, and as we passed some bushes, one of the soldiers gave me a shove and said, "Get under there and don't make a sound. Don't come out until we come for you." I scrambled under the bush, terrified, as shots, shells, and shouts sounded in the distance. Day grew into night, and no one came for me. Eventually, the sounds of fighting died down, but I was too terrified to move. I stayed under there most of the next day. By this time, I had pissed and shit myself, and my legs were numb. Finally, an eerie silence fell over the area, punctuated by an occasional far-off voice echo, but I couldn't tell if it was an American or Vietnamese. Eventually, I heard a helicopter, and the thought twanged into my head like a released arrow. It's now or never. Grunting with the pain of trying to move my deadened legs, I rolled out from under the bush and ran toward the helicopter. My brain was so scattered I didn't know who I was or what I was doing. After seeing all the dead bodies, Tommy licking the knife, and then putting the ears on a rope, all I could do was run to the chopper. I didn't know if it was ours or theirs, but I knew I couldn't say where I was. Even if it's Vietnamese, I thought. Either way, I'm dead. I ran across an open field, waving my arms. "Hey, wait for me." As I got closer, I could see 3 American choppers, and my body flooded with relief. I didn't care that they pointed their rifles at me. I just kept running toward them. As I got closer, they lowered their weapons. I made it to the nearest chopper, and the soldiers stared at me, frozen and wide-eyed like I was a mirage. Only when I reached them did I realize I was an actual kid with crapped-in pants and wearing an ear necklace, running through a jungle war zone. One said, "What the hell are you doing here, kid?" I shook my head, too breathless to speak, and they pulled me on board. I lay panting on the floor as the chopper took off. The pilot kept turning his head around to look at me. He said, "Who are you? You're just a little kid." I shook my head and said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, don't worry about it, okay? We'll find out who you are and your family, but you're one of us now, okay?" We reached an army base and the pilot took me to the commander's tent. I sat in a chair across from his desk, feeling numb with disbelief. Everything was a blur. The commander looked at me with narrow, disbelieving eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. I was so scatterbrained I didn't know who I was. I said, "I honestly don't know." He shook his head and said, "Well, we'll get this figured out. Meanwhile, you need to get some clean clothes on and get rid of that necklace." In my shocked state, I clutched the necklace defensively and shook my head. The commander said I could make a new necklace by collecting discarded peel tops from beer and soda cans that littered the base. I was there for a few days. They gave me a uniform that didn't fit, so I used rubber bands to hold it down and walked around the base, picking up soda tops for my necklace. The guys there were all trying to figure out why I was there, who I came with, and how I got there. After a few days, a government agent came to get me, someone I'd never seen before. I was flown back to the States and back to Bullhead City. I had only been home a few weeks when my mother, Jackie, was murdered. We were sitting in the garage. As I worked changing tires, we talked about how we would move and start our lives over. My mother said, "It won't be easy, but I really want to start a new life with you. We can do it. You can work in a garage and we can make a living and do our own thing. We'll be our own little family." She spoke with a glassy-eyed, faraway look that unsettled me despite the comforting and reassuring words. She was in a daze, and I could tell she was still recovering from a recent breakdown. Then she walked into the office and adjacent to the garage, and the next thing I knew, I heard shots, pop, pop, pop. Racing outside, I saw her lying in a pool of blood, and I screamed and tried to run over to her. I wanted to gather her in my arms, but a government agent appeared out of nowhere, grabbed me by the arm, and pressed a gun to my head. Another agent came from behind and they forced me into a station wagon where I saw a little girl I had met the day before but couldn't recall who she was. We drove to an office building that resembled a police station and they brought me to a room with desks and a table. I was shocked and crying hysterically, but the two agents were oblivious. Seated at a table, they calmly discussed the profits from the murder, which involved stocks and shares in Kellogg and General Mills. Then one of them walked over and put a piece of paper in front of me. He said, "This is a confession saying you killed your mother. I want you to sign it." I shook my head, still crying, and screamed, "No, no." A dark-haired, muscular man in a suit barged into the office just then. He had a gun in one hand and a badge in the other. He said, "I'm taking this kid." He grabbed me and dragged me out of the building and into his car. We drove around for days. I never saw anyone so scared in my life. He kept driving in circles. My heart sank when we pulled up in front of the Quigley's. I stumbled out of the car, stared blearily at the house, and collapsed to my knees, burying my head in this dirt and throwing fistfuls of it over my head. Tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I had lost my entire family to murder, only to return to my step-family who treated me like shit. And we'll end this part here. Thanks.